I froze the moment his hands trembled against my back. It should have been a simple massage, just a moment of comfort after a long day. But when I felt the tension in his touch, something shifted. My heart raced, my skin tingled, and I knew this wasn't normal. I wanted to stop him, to say something, but I couldn't. And that one moment changed everything between us, forever. I always believed we were inseparable, a team against the world. When my husband left, my son, Jake, was only 2 years old. From that moment, it was just the two of us. I devoted my life to him, determined to give him everything his father never could. He grew up knowing he was my priority, my anchor, my entire world. Raising him alone wasn't easy. I worked late shifts, juggled bills, and sacrificed my own happiness just to make sure he never felt the void his father left behind. Despite the struggles, we built a bond so strong that it felt unbreakable. Jake wasn't just my son, he was my best friend, my confidant. He grew up to be kind, caring, and responsible, always making sure I was okay, even when he was just a boy. As he got older, he took on more responsibilities around the house, making me proud of the man he was becoming. But somewhere along the way, our closeness started to feel different. Too close, perhaps. I never thought much of it at first. He'd always been affectionate, a quick hug here, a gentle touch there, but it was easy to brush off as harmless. After all, he'd been my rock for years. I relied on him more than I probably should have. When I was overwhelmed or lonely, he was always there, and I let myself lean on him too much. That night started out like any other. I came home exhausted, my body aching from work. I collapsed onto the couch, barely able to move. Jake, always attentive, noticed my discomfort immediately. "Mom, let me help," he said, grabbing a towel and sitting beside me. I hesitated. I wasn't used to letting someone take care of me. But his voice was so gentle, so full of concern, that I gave in. As his hands began working the knots in my back, I felt the tension start to ease. His touch was firm yet tender, and for a moment I let myself relax. But then something changed, a hesitation in his movements, a shift in the air. And in that moment, everything about us began to unravel. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment of awkwardness, an overreaction in my own mind. But as Jake's hands moved across my back, I couldn't ignore the way my body tensed. There was something about his touch that felt different, too deliberate, too lingering. I brushed it off at first. He's just trying to help, I thought. He's always been caring, always worried about me. But the longer his hands lingered, the harder it became to push away the uneasy feeling growing inside me. His fingers brushed the edge of my shirt, and I flinched, not because it hurt but because it felt too intimate. My pulse quickened, and I shifted slightly, hoping to ease the tension. But Jake didn't stop. Instead, his hands hesitated, as if he noticed the shift between us two. The room grew unbearably silent. The hum of the refrigerator faded. The ticking clock blurred into the background. All I could hear was the sound of our breathing, mine quick and shallow, his deep and steady. I wanted to say something, to break the silence, to create space between us. But the words caught in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to speak, to acknowledge what I was feeling, what I was afraid he might be feeling too. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining it, that I was just tired, stressed, reading too much into a harmless gesture. But when I shifted again to sit up, I felt it. His hands froze, his breath hitched, and the weight of the moment came crashing down on me. Panic surged through me, but I stayed still, pretending not to notice. Pretending I didn't feel the tremble in his touch, or the way his body shifted closer instead of pulling away. In that moment, 1,000 questions flooded my mind. Had I leaned on him too much? Had I blurred the lines without realizing it? Was this my fault? Or had he misread the closeness we shared? Mistaken my love and affection for something else entirely? I finally sat up, pulling away quickly and fixing my shirt. Jake's eyes darted away, his face flushed as he stood up without a word and left the room. I should have said something then. I should have set boundaries, created distance, made it clear that what had just happened was a mistake, a misunderstanding. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, replaying the moment in my head, questioning everything. The way his hands lingered, the hesitation in his touch, the tension in the air. I told myself it was nothing, but the guilt wouldn't go away. And as the days passed, it only grew worse. Jake started avoiding me after that night. He stopped lingering in the living room, stopped joining me for meals, stopped looking me in the eye. The easy closeness we once shared felt strained, broken. And yet, every time we crossed paths, I could feel it, the weight of what we weren't saying, the silence thick between us. I began second-guessing everything. Every touch, every glance, every moment we'd shared. Had I relied on him too much, leaned on him in ways a mother shouldn't? Or was it something else entirely? The tension only deepened when he started staying out later than usual, coming home long after I'd gone to bed. I didn't ask where he'd been. I was too afraid of what the answer might be. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, I couldn't forget the way his hands felt on my back, or the way my own body reacted. And that terrified me. The days after that night were agonizing. Jake barely spoke to me, and when he did, his words were clipped, hollow, like he was forcing himself to be normal. But nothing about us felt normal anymore. I tried to push the memory of that night out of my mind, but it lingered. His trembling hands, the tension in his breath, the way my own body betrayed me with heat I didn't want to acknowledge. I hated myself for it. One night, after hours of pacing my room, I finally broke. I knocked on his door. My heart raced as I waited, and when he opened it, I saw the hesitation in his eyes, the fear that mirrored my own. "Can we talk?" I asked softly. He nodded and stepped aside, and I entered, suddenly unsure of what I was even going to say. I sat on the edge of his bed, my fingers twisting nervously in my lap. Before I could speak, he did. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't know what happened. He stopped, looking down at his hands, and my chest tightened. I wanted to comfort him, to make it okay, but I couldn't even comfort myself. "It's not your fault," I whispered. "It was just a mistake." But even as I said it, the words felt hollow. Neither of us really believed it was that simple. Over the next few days, things didn't get better. In fact, they got worse. The distance between us became unbearable, but every time we were near each other, I could feel it, something unspoken, electric, dangerous. It was in the way his eyes lingered when he thought I wasn't looking. The way he seemed nervous whenever we were alone. The way my body tensed whenever he touched me. Even the smallest, most innocent brush of his hand sent my heart racing. I hated myself for noticing. One evening, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard him come in. I felt him behind me before I even turned around, close enough that I could feel his breath on my neck. I froze. "Mom," his voice was barely a whisper. I turned slowly, and the look in his eyes stole my breath. "Jake," I tried to sound firm, but my voice wavered. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine like he was begging me to say something, anything, that would make sense of what was happening between us. I wanted to stop him, to push him away, to set boundaries we should have set long ago. But I didn't move. Instead, I let the moment hang there, thick and heavy. And then he touched me, a soft, lingering touch on my arm. My skin burned under his fingertips, and I knew I should pull away. But I didn't. I hated myself for it, but I stayed there, letting the silence grow louder, letting the tension build until it felt like I couldn't breathe. When I finally did move, it was abrupt. I stepped back, breaking the spell and nearly knocking over the glass on the counter. "This can't happen," I said quickly, my voice sharp, panicked. He looked hurt, confused, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. But then he just nodded and walked away, leaving me standing there, shaking. I wanted to believe that was the end of it, that I'd finally put a stop to whatever this was. But it didn't end there. The tension lingered, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it wouldn't go away. Late at night, I lay awake, replaying every touch, every glance, every moment we'd shared since that night. And the more I thought about it, the more I hated myself, for not stopping it sooner, for letting things get this far, and for the feelings I couldn't seem to bury. Because the truth was, as much as I hated myself for it, part of me didn't want it to stop. And that terrified me. The breaking point came on a night I'll never forget, because it shattered everything. I had spent the day trying to keep my mind occupied, cleaning, organizing, anything to avoid being alone with my thoughts. But no matter how hard I tried, my mind kept drifting back to him. To his hands. To that lingering touch I couldn't erase. By the time night fell, I was exhausted. I collapsed onto the couch, telling myself I'd finally let it go. That this, whatever it was over. But then Jake walked in. He stood in the doorway, his eyes shadowed with something I couldn't read. "Mom," he said, his voice low, hesitant. I sat up, immediately on edge. "What is it?" He stepped closer, and I could feel it again, that thick, suffocating tension wrapping around us like a vice. "I can't stop thinking about it," he admitted, his voice breaking. "That night, my heart stopped. Jake!" He sat down beside me before I could finish, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch mine. "I know it's wrong. I know I shouldn't feel this way," he whispered, his voice raw. "But I do. And I don't know how to stop." I yanked my hand away, my entire body trembling. No, I said sharply, standing up. This has to stop, Jake. It's not right. We can't. Then why does it feel like this? He cut in, his voice suddenly louder, more desperate. Why can't I stop thinking about you? Why can't I forget the way it felt? Tears welled in my eyes as I backed away, shaking my head. You have to forget it, I said. You have to let it go. But you felt it too, he said, and the words hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was wrong. But I couldn't lie. He wasn't wrong. And that was the worst part. Tears streamed down my face as I turned away, pressing my hands to my temples as if I could block out his voice, his words. Please, he whispered, stepping closer. When I turned around, his face was so full of pain, of longing, that my resolve nearly crumbled. But then I saw it. The same trembling hands, the same hesitation, the same guilt that mirrored my own. And that's when I finally snapped. Stop it! I screamed, shoving him back. You're my son, Jake. My son. Do you understand what that means? He stumbled but didn't retreat, his eyes filling with tears. I don't care, he yelled back. I love you, Mom. And I don't know how to make it stop. The room spun, and I felt like I was going to collapse. You don't love me like that, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You can't. But even as I said it, I knew the damage was already done. He did love me like that. And nothing I said could undo it. For the first time I saw it clearly, not just in his words but in his eyes. The way he looked at me, not as his mother, but as a woman. And in that moment, I hated myself more than I ever had before, because some small, dark part of me didn't want to push him away. I finally broke down, sobbing as I fell onto the couch. Jake knelt beside me, his hands hovering near mine but not touching this time. I'm sorry, he whispered. I don't want to hurt you. I don't know how to fix this. Neither did I. For hours, we sat there, crying, apologizing, and saying all the things we'd been too afraid to say before. And by the time the sun started to rise, we were both broken. I told him we needed space. That things had to change. That we couldn't keep pretending this didn't happen. He agreed. But as he packed a bag and left to stay with a friend for a while, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were both running from something we couldn't escape. Because no matter how much distance we put between us, I knew the damage had already been done. And I had no idea if we'd ever be able to put the pieces back together. The house felt empty without him. The silence was deafening, broken only by the echoes of our last conversation replaying in my mind. I told myself this was for the best, that space would help us both heal. But the truth was, I felt more alone than ever before. I kept expecting to hear his footsteps, to see him walking through the door with that familiar smile that once brought me so much comfort. But instead, all I had were memories that felt tainted now, twisted by guilt and shame. I spent the first few days in denial, convincing myself that we could move past this. That time would erase what had happened, and we'd go back to being the way we were before. But deep down I knew better. I knew things could never go back to how they were. When Jake finally called, my heart leapt, and then sank just as quickly when I heard the distance in his voice. I think I need more time, he said. I'm not ready to come home. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. But I didn't argue. I didn't beg him to come back. Instead, I said, take all the time you need, even though it killed me. The days turned into weeks, and every moment apart felt heavier than the last. I tried to stay busy, throwing myself into work, rearranging the house, anything to avoid the crushing weight of loneliness. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the guilt. I kept asking myself the same questions over and over again. How did this happen? How did we get here? Was it my fault? Did I lean on him too much? Did I blur the lines without realizing it? Or was it him? Was he the one who crossed the line, twisting my affection into something it was never meant to be? The truth was, I didn't have answers. All I had were regrets. I thought about the way he looked at me that night, how desperate, how conflicted he'd been. And I hated myself for not stopping it sooner. But what scared me most was the part of me that didn't hate it, that moment of weakness, of flattery, that I couldn't erase. I avoided mirrors, afraid of the woman staring back at me. A woman who'd let things spiral out of control. A woman who should have known better. When Jake finally came home weeks later, the tension was unbearable. We barely spoke, moving around each other like strangers. The easy closeness we once shared had been replaced by walls we couldn't seem to break down. I tried to pretend everything was fine, to smile, to make small talk, to act like the past hadn't happened. But the way he looked at me, guarded, hesitant, made it clear that it wasn't fine. We were both broken. One night, I finally tried to talk about it. "We need to address this, Jake," I said, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. His eyes darkened. "There's nothing to talk about." "There is," I insisted. "We can't keep pretending this didn't happen." He slammed his fist down on the table, startling me. I said there's nothing to talk about. I froze, stunned by his anger. But when I looked closer, I saw the pain in his eyes, the same pain I felt. I wanted to reach out to him to fix things, but I didn't know how. So I let it go. And that's how we lived, tiptoeing around each other, pretending everything was fine while silently falling apart. I watched as he withdrew further and further, spending more time out of the house, avoiding me whenever he could. And every time he left, I felt like I was losing him all over again. The guilt was suffocating, not just for what had happened, but for the things I couldn't bring myself to say. I wanted to tell him that I loved him, that no matter how broken we were, I wasn't going to give up on him. But the words never came. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us, hoping that time would heal what we'd broken. But deep down I knew it wouldn't. Because some wounds don't heal. Some wounds leave scars that never fade. And I was terrified that this, whatever it was, had already destroyed us. The weeks turned into months, and though Jake and I shared the same house, it felt like we were miles apart. The silence between us was heavier than ever, each unspoken word adding to the weight of what we couldn't face. I often lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in my mind. The hesitation in his touch, the tension in his voice, and the look in his eyes that I couldn't forget. But more than anything, I replayed my own reactions. The way I froze. The way I let the moment linger longer than it should have. And the way part of me, a part one hated, hadn't wanted it to end. I hated myself for not being stronger. For not setting clearer boundaries. For letting my loneliness cloud my judgment and blur the lines between what was safe and what wasn't. I wanted to believe we could move past it, but the damage had already been done. The bond we once shared, so natural, so effortless, had been tainted. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't go back to the way things were. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I knocked on his door, my heart pounding as I waited for him to answer. When he finally opened it, his eyes were wary, guarded, like he was bracing himself for another confrontation. But this time I didn't come to fight. "I'm sorry," I said softly. He stared at me for a long moment before stepping aside and letting me in. We sat on the edge of his bed, the air thick with everything we weren't saying. "I should have stopped it sooner," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I should have protected you. I failed you as a mother." Jake shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. "No, Mom. I'm the one who—" "Don't," I cut in. "This isn't your fault. You were confused. I let things get too close, too complicated. That's on me." For the first time in weeks, he reached for my hand, and I let him. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You won't, I promised. But we can't let this moment define us. We have to move forward." He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. And I felt it too, because moving forward wouldn't be easy. We decided to seek counseling, not just for him, but for both of us. It wasn't about fixing what had happened. It was about learning how to rebuild the boundaries we'd lost and finding a way to heal from the pain we'd caused each other. Through therapy, I learned to face my own insecurities, the loneliness I'd buried, the ways I'd leaned on Jake when I should have been standing on my own. And Jake learned to confront the confusion he felt, to separate love from longing, and to understand that what had happened wasn't his fault. It wasn't an overnight fix. It took time, long, painful months of honesty, reflection, and forgiveness. But slowly we began to heal. I'll never forget what happened that night, and I know Jake won't either. It's a scar we'll both carry, a reminder of how fragile boundaries can be and how quickly they can blur. But it's also a reminder of how strong love can be, how it can survive even the darkest moments if you're willing to face the truth and fight for it. I don't know what the future holds for us, but I know this: we're still here, still trying, still holding on. And maybe that's enough. What would you have done in her situation? Could their relationship ever truly heal? Or was the damage too deep? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story left you on edge, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more shocking, emotional stories that push the boundaries of love, betrayal, and forbidden feelings.